Hello everyone, in today's video I continue the Prerunner project by painting the cage, adding hood vents, fender flares, and completing the roof rack, and I also add some panel lines to the Skyline and complete its all-wheel drive 3D printed chassis with some improved components. So today I'm going to be starting off with the Prerunner project. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this build, I'm using an inexpensive Fiyu Fighter 1 1/12 scale short course truck as a base, and I've been modifying the appearance by adding a custom cage and mounting this 1972 Chevy pickup body. I'm starting off by focusing on the body, starting with the windows. As you may recall, I cut out the windows since I will be painting this body, and I figured it would be easier to remove the windows and install new ones, instead of tediously masking them. Doing so left a rough edge around the perimeter, which I wanted to sand smooth. I started by using some sandpaper in a few spots, as well as a rotary tool with a small grinding bit, which works well in rounded corners such as the lower corners of the windshield. I used a hobby knife in a few areas like the front vent windows where the space is too small to sand. After sanding all of the edges, I moved on to sanding around the back of the cab, where the 3D printed piece is attached to the rest of the body. I wanted to make the transition between the two pieces as smooth as possible. I also wanted to trim a little bit of material from the bottom and sand that section smooth. Because I will be painting this body from the outside, I sanded around the entire outer surface so that the primer and paint will better adhere to the surface. I decided to fill these dimples on the hood with a little bit of Tester's contour putty. The purpose of these is to mark where the holes should be drilled for mounting the body onto certain chassis. Since I won't be drilling any holes into the body, filling and sanding them smooth will look much better. I simply spread a little bit of the putty onto the surface and then let it dry and then sand it smooth until it is flush with the rest of the hood. I had an idea for creating some hood vents that look like the ones here, which I wanted to try out on this body. I started by roughly sketching the shape and size that I wanted the vents to be. I then began modeling a piece that will be glued to the underside of the hood. This piece will form the sides of the vents and give the section that will be cut and folded down a place to be mounted to, as you'll see later on. Designing this part was very simple. I just made two sketches that you see here, and I then extruded each sketch and used a Boolean intersect command to create the body. I then created an additional sketch to cut a section into the front. I mirrored the design, printed out both pieces, and positioned them where I wanted on the underside of the body. I then marked the position. I used a hot knife to cut through the body. Since this body is made from relatively thick polycarbonate, it doesn't cut through it as easy as it does through some thinner materials, so the cut ended up not being very clean. Because of this, I needed to do some additional trimming and sanding around the vent openings to make them as smooth as possible. After doing this, the cuts for the vents were looking much better. Next, I glued each of the vent pieces to the underside of the hood, making sure that they are lined up correctly and are as symmetrical as possible. I trimmed away any excess glue, and then I scored the body where it will be bent. I roughly measured the size of the vents and cut a piece of styrene to the correct size and shape. This piece will be placed on the underside of the vent and will provide a place for the body to be glued to. I used a little bit of heat to give the piece a slight curve. Once this piece was the correct size and shape, I duplicated it for the other side. With each fitted well, I glued them to the bottom of each 3D printed piece, and glued the tab I created in the body to the styrene piece. At this point, the hood vents were looking great, and I think they make an awesome addition to the body. If you would like to try something similar and plan on painting the body from the inside, you're really going to want to try and make the cuts a lot cleaner than what I did here, which would be a lot easier to do on a body made from a thinner material. And the parts that I designed and 3D printed could also easily be made from styrene. Since I will be painting this body from the outside, I wanted to do some sanding around the edges to further smooth them out. I also wanted to apply some milliput putty to certain sections, which I sculpted to the shape that I wanted, and then will later sand these areas. Milliput is a two-part epoxy putty, so equal parts of each component needs to be thoroughly mixed together before applying. Once thoroughly mixed, I begin applying the putty. I use some water to thin it down and to help make the surface smoother. I also applied the putty around the back of the cab where the two parts meet. I let the milliput set overnight. The following day, I was ready to sand. Since I spread it on thick in the back, I started with the rotary tool and then moved to sandpaper and a file. At this point, the body is ready for a coat of primer. This will help to identify any sections that need any further sanding. Moving on to the cage, I spent some time brainstorming how I wanted to mount the cage to the chassis. I started by making the rear section be able to be secured to the factory body post holes on the back. To do this, I started by drilling some pilot holes, followed by 3mm holes for metal rods to be inserted into. I marked the length that I wanted the rods, cut them to the correct size, and glued them to the cage. This will aid in positioning the rear half of the cage. I plan on securing the cage and body using magnets, which I will be showing in a future video. I moved on to painting both cage pieces, first masking off the rods. I started by applying one final thick coat of primer, followed by several thick coats of paint. For a part like this that has been FDM 3D printed, I find that laying on the paint really thick helps to smooth out the surface and make the individual layers less visible. Using thicker paint like this Rust-Oleum satin black I'm using seems to help as well. Here's a look at the finished painted cage. I'm very pleased with the finished result. Taking the time to apply a resin coating and many coats of primer and paint has paid off. In a previous video, I did some work on this roof rack. The only thing left to do now is to add some 3mm LEDs to the light buckets. I started by soldering all the LEDs in series, taking note of which sides are positive and negative. After they were all wired, I did a quick test to make sure they were all illuminating. After confirming that they all worked, I applied a little bit of heat shrink to cover the solder and cut away the excess leads. Next, I removed each light bucket from the rack to make installing each LED easier. I used a little bit of glue to secure each LED into the light buckets. After all of the LEDs were in place, I remounted the light buckets. This roof rack looks great with the LEDs installed and is definitely going to make an awesome addition to the truck. Another item that's going to make a great addition to the truck is some custom front Prerunner style fenders. I scanned the body a while back, and I'm using that scan to aid in the design of this piece, which I'm modeling in Blender. I found that coming up with a design that I liked was a bit difficult since these fenders have to accommodate the larger than scale tires, so therefore the wheel openings have to be very large. I also couldn't find a whole lot of relevant reference images of huge fenders on this body style of truck. Despite this though, after a bit of messing around with the design, I ended up with a result that I was satisfied with. I printed out both fenders and test fit them to the body. The fitment is great, and I really like the wild look of these larger fenders. So far I'm very pleased with how this build is progressing. It's really starting to take on a Prerunner or trophy truck style look. Getting the body mounted, designing some bedside pieces, and getting the body painted are the next steps for this project, as well as making a custom front bumper and adding the interior. I've been continuing with the Skyline build by making a bit of progress on both the body and chassis. While handling the body, I accidentally cracked the rear bumper. Because this crack was a bit unsightly, I wanted to try and repair it first by doing a bit of sanding around it. After that, I used some putty to fill in the crack. After letting the putty dry, I sanded it smooth. I then brushed on a little bit of paint, doing my best to blend it with the rest of the bumper. As I've talked about before, I wanted to try adding some panel lines to the body. Because many of the panel lines are very faint, I figured the only option would be to paint or draw on the lines with a marker. I decided to try airbrushing the lines, first by masking around the panel gap and carefully applying some fast-drying acrylic paint in several light coats. This process produced a decent result, though getting the lines as thin as I'd like them was quite difficult, especially in curved sections, though adding the lines this way is certainly better than what I could do using a marker or brush. I continued this process to apply all of the panel lines to the body. I didn't want to spend a huge amount of time working on this body, so I wasn't overly concerned about making the lines perfect. If I was doing this to a body that I really wanted to try and make as accurate as possible, I would spend more time masking, doing my best to make sure that the lines are as thin and consistent as possible, and I would mix the paint for the lines so that it stands out less against the body color. Of course, the better solution will be to adjust the design and print settings so that the body lines are deep and well defined in the finished body. One technique that I tried that ended up being a lot quicker and produced a thinner line was to lay down a single piece of tape along where I wanted the line to be and used an X-Acto knife to cut a path and then use a toothpick to widen that cut. Although these panel lines stand out a bit more than what I'd like them to, I'm still very satisfied with the results, and I think the body looks way better with them than without them. I printed out some new parts for the chassis that I will be using. I ended up printing out a new base piece since I noticed that the wheelbase of the current chassis is a bit too short. I began by removing all of the components from the first chassis and transferred them over to the new, slightly longer chassis piece. As you may recall in the last video, I mentioned that I needed to make some design adjustments to the steering arm since it was colliding with the drive shaft socket. As you can see, the steering arm no longer collides with the moving parts below. One modification that I needed to make was to lengthen the drive shaft since the wheelbase has been increased. I cut the drive shaft into 2 pieces and then added a small spacer that I printed between them. I applied some grease to all the gears and made sure everything was rotating smoothly. I then began installing all of the knuckles. I printed some new bushings for the rear knuckles, which are a bit more snug to help eliminate some of the play in the rear knuckles that I discussed previously. I also adjusted the position of the front knuckle when I designed the new lower chassis piece, so that the knuckle would now be better aligned with the differential, and therefore being able to turn sharper than before. Once the knuckles were in place, I installed the springs and the upper mounts. The chassis is now complete. All that is left is to add the remaining electronics and install the wheels, as well as figure out how exactly I'm going to mount the body to the chassis. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this vehicle performs. And to conclude today's video, I want to showcase some of the awesome work and amazing vehicles from the Make It RC Facebook group. I also want to give a channel shout out to EPA Crawlers. This channel has a fantastic variety of detailed build videos and crawling footage. I highly recommend checking it out. The link to it is below in the description. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you next time.